Good evening to everyone. Nothing could be more appropriate a way to start our course, our session than a little bit of mood music.
They should have played that when Joe was president of the center.
I did. You didn't go that meeting.
But you remember that, Manny? I don't remember ever hearing them play it for them.
We'll see. Just want to make sure, can people hear me?
Yes.
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 Yeah, we're good.
Okay,
Yeah,
most
yeah.
of you have your yeah, because our internet dropped momentarily, for which I apologize. Hopefully it will not happen again. If it does, then we'll persevere. So that was Hail to the Chief by the United States Navy Band, and words of introduction. I am going to mute everybody right now just because there is background noises that people have at home, and that can sometimes make it hard for others to hear. Even white noise in the background gets picked up by the microphone. So here we are on the eve of election night. And we are going into a period, as we have for every 4 years when we've elected a president. I'm not going to get in to the politics of this election, but I did want to go back and use the opportunity for us
Well, y'all can unmute and talk to each other till the rabbi gets back.
That's a great idea. Anybody have a joke? Oh, he's back.
Rabbi, you need to unmute. We can't hear you.
All right. Well,
There
hopefully
you
can
go.
now.
Yeah.
I will refer this to Jennifer, and hopefully we've been having kind of a wonky internet, so I hope that's the end of it and that we are good. But so anyway, as we enter into this period between the election and the inauguration, it's an opportunity for us to look back at how American presidents have interacted with Jewish citizens, how they have looked at Judaism, or in some cases, more broadly, religion, how have they addressed Jewish concerns, and not so much in the early years of our republic, but later on, as there was more awareness and prominence and the reach of America into foreign affairs grew longer, how various administrations treated matters of Jewish importance abroad and what they brought to that. Especially when we get to the 20th century and in the presidencies of FDR and Harry Truman, two presidents whose terms in office really spanned the Shoah, the Holocaust, and then the creation of the State of Israel. That will be something of great focus. So we're going to start tonight, and over the course of the next 2 months, look at the presidencies of a variety of individuals, doing this chronologically. Our journey begins tonight with the very first president, George Washington. Now, Washington was a figure of enormous popularity just across the board in the United States, not only as the commander-in-chief, but the humility that he brought to his role. Washington resigned his commission as the commander-in-chief in a very moving scene at Francis's Tavern in New York City. There's still a marker. You can actually go into the site and see where he met with his officers. But he could have used his political power, his military power, in a very adverse way, but he didn't. Similarly, his presidency, when he stepped down, he served a second term with a certain degree of reluctance, but he did for what was the good of the nation. But when he stepped down, he really and truly stepped down. Adams, who was at the time as vice president, wanted Washington to be called Your Excellency, and he had all sorts of titles that he thought would be befitting the president of the United States. It was Washington who decided that he would simply be called Mr. President. And it has been ever since Washington that is what we call not only a sitting president, but even a former president, simply Mr. President. Now, when Washington was elected, keep in mind that then, as even today, the elections are conducted through electors. Especially then, there were no direct elections when Washington ran in 1789. It was the state legislatures that counted the eligible votes, and there were, various qualifications as to who could even vote. And it was on the basis of those votes that the state legislature appointed the electors, who in turn convened to actually choose the president. Washington was elected unanimously by 69 electors in 1789. All 10 states were unanimously in favor of Washington. Now, I say 10 states. Why 10 states? I thought there were 13. Well, New York couldn't decide which electors to send to Philadelphia. And Rhode Island and North Carolina hadn't yet ratified the Constitution. So there were 10 states that assembled for the business of electing a president, and Washington was picked unanimously. And in 1793, after the 1792 election, once again, he was unanimously chosen, this time by all 13 states. Now, in 1790, there were about 1,500 Jews living in the United States, out of a population of 3.9 million. You can do the math, but there weren't very many Jews. About 20% of them lived in New York, and the others were scattered: Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. And then shortly thereafter, Richmond. There were about 100 Jews who served in either the Continental Army or in the state militias. And Jewish officers, this is how Washington actually met the Jews that he did know. So there was Francis Salvador of South Carolina, who was actually the first American Jew killed on the side of the Patriots. He was killed by Native Americans allied with the British in 1776. And there was Benjamin Nunez, who was a Jewish immigrant from France. We'll learn a little bit more about Nunez later, who settled in Philadelphia. He reached the rank of major, and he served on Washington's own staff. After the war, he became president of of Mikveh Israel, the synagogue in Philadelphia. And I'm going to just bring up a picture. Let's see, here we go. I'll share that on the screen. Okay, go. Hopefully folks can see that. That is Nunez's grave. It's in Ladino, it's more like Nunez, even though it looks like Nons or Nunes. Major Benjamin Nunez, revolutionary patriot. He was married to Miriam Marks Nunez, and he is buried, as along with his wife, in the cemetery of Mikveh Israel. One of the most interesting Jewish military figures whose path crossed Washington was David Franks, David Salisbury Franks. It's a little confusing because there was another Jewish guy, David Franks, who was a loyalist, but this is not he. Now, David Salisbury Franks, what made him so interesting was that he was the aide de camp of a certain general named Benedict Arnold. Arnold harbored deep resentments at what he perceived as being slights and insults, and it was over the course in 1780 he began to correspond with the British. His wife, whom he married while he was in the military commander of Philadelphia, was a loyalist, and he began to scheme with the British to give them West Point. It wasn't a military academy in those days. It was a fort on the Hudson. Washington was a very important post. It really controlled traffic up and down the river. The Patriots were in control of the upper Hudson Valley. The British still were in New York City. But West Point is a very narrow point in the river. There was a chain across the river stopping warships from going up. And because of its narrowness, there were forts on both sides. So Arnold conspired to give the plans and engineer a way for the British to capture West Point and garrison across the river, which would have been, a really, really bad thing for the Patriots, for the revolutionary forces. Now, David Franks had nothing to do with this. He was completely innocent. Let's see, let me get this photo up. up, and I will share this with you as well. Okay, hopefully everybody can see this in just a second. Here it is. Distinguished Jewish officer, aide-de-camp to General Benedict Arnold during the Revolutionary War. He was thought to be complicit in Arnold's treason, but he was exonerated. He died of yellow fever, and he was buried at Christ Church by a Christian neighbor in Philadelphia. And there is a plaque there if you want to see what he looked like. That's what David Salisbury Franks looked like. It was just a pencil and a drawing that was done of him. He was rather young when he died. In any event, so he was arrested after Benedict Arnold. The plot failed. He skedaddled and made it to the British lines. Benedict Arnold, though, had something of a conscience, and he wrote to Washington to explain that in no way was Franks participatory in the plot, that he was completely innocent. And he was acquitted because there really was no evidence, but that wasn't enough for Franks. He wanted a special separate inquiry to totally exonerate him. So he wrote to Washington, and Washington granted him a court of inquiry, and he was fully exonerated. And the following year, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He was also sent to France to help John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, who were abroad trying to negotiate loans with the French and the Dutch. And he became the vice consul in Marseille for a period of time. But of course, Washington's most important relationship with a Jewish individual was Chaim Salomon. And Chaim Salomon was born in Poland. He immigrated to New York in 1772, and he began a brokerage business. Now, when the war broke out, he began to sell continental bills of exchange. The Continental Congress issued bills of exchange. In exchange, he gave them hard French and Dutch currency. And he took in return bills that, well, weren't worth that much and whose future was pretty uncertain. He could have charged a ton of interest, right, for what amounted to junk bonds. But he believed in the Patriots' cause, and he only charged 1/4% on all of those transactions, a very minuscule amount. The Continental Congress was so appreciative of his efforts that they made him an official broker to the Office of Finance of the United States. And time and again, Washington turned to Salomon directly. Why? Because Washington would write to Congress over and over, we need money, we need supplies, I can't pay the soldiers, I can't pay the officers, we have no ammunition. And, Congress turned a blind ear. But Salomon would always go out to try to raise the money. And during the war, he advanced more than $200,000 to the American Army. He borrowed funds to satisfy the needs of the Continental Army. By the way, in today's dollars, that's like 6.3 million. Not once, but twice, the British arrested him. They knew what he was up to. He was released the first time, but he was convicted of espionage and sentenced to death the second time. He managed to escape from prison. When Salomon died, he lived through the end of the war. Sadly, when he died in 1785, he left his widow and his young children saddled with a debt of over $600,000, which, you can do the math. That's somewhere in the realm of 17, $18 million today. So he died, more than penniless. He died deep, deep in debt. In 1941, there was a statue of Washington. If you've ever been to Chicago, you can see this statue. It's a statue of Washington in the middle, and on one side is Robert Morris, not Philip Morris's brother. Robert Morris was the first superintendent of the Treasury, and Chaim Solomon's on the other side. Now, the statue was not put up by the federal government. It was put up by the local Jewish community that wanted to honor this American patriot. It wasn't until the bicentennial year, 1976, that a stamp was issued to honor Solomon's role as patriot. Now, during Washington's first administration, he visited the Touro synagogue while he was in Newport. A day after, the Jewish community sent him a letter thanking him for visiting, and then he responded with a reply that has become famous in its own right. I'll read an excerpt of it. You may have seen, there's a facsimile at the Touro synagogue. The actual letter was bought by a collector in Maryland. I don't know, God knows how much. And it is lent out by members of his family, heirs, but nowhere else can you see it except by permission. Washington did have other letters. He wrote another letter that was sent in duplicate copies to Richmond, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. That, I believe, is in it's in the archives of the United States, that letter, or a copy of that letter, but not Washington's famous letter. Now, Washington's letter, by the way, and he really didn't take great time. He actually copied much of the language that the folks in the Touro synagogue had sent him. So he just took phrases from their letter to him. But nevertheless, I mean, in the late 18th century, considering the status of Jews everywhere through the world, this is an amazing letter. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Washington here is paraphrasing words from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Micah. It's interesting, by the way, what was Washington doing, in Rhode Island? Presidents didn't go on swing tours in those days. It was part of actually a backroom deal that brought him to Rhode Island and, by extension, the Touro synagogue. Washington very much wanted all 13 states to ratify the Constitution. You only needed 9 to go into effect, but he believed very strongly you needed all 13. And in order to make it unanimous, Rhode Island was a holdout. So he said, okay, here's the deal. If Rhode Island approves the Constitution, I, George Washington, and my cabinet, my officers, will make a personal visit to your state. And then they said, all right, well, you're a popular guy, and sure. So they ratified the Constitution. Washington came to Providence and Newport, and while he was in the latter, he went into the Touro synagogue. So the very first president is the very first president to visit a synagogue, but all because of this backroom detail. One or two other things, and then we'll move on. We'll take a moment just to debrief and questions, but just to talk a little bit about Washington's own religious views. He was a deeply religious person, but not a sectarian one. His most common term for God was providence, 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 providence. He uses it in his letter to the Jews in Newport. He uses it in a lot of his correspondence. He speaks of the mild and benevolent power of Christianity, at least as he practiced it, but he held that all religions and nearly all religious practices were beneficial to people. In fact, during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, he made it his business to attend different worship services on different days. So he went to, even though he was Church of England, or after the war, he was an Episcopalian, he attended Presbyterian services, he went to Catholic services, he went to Quaker services, and he did that quite deliberately. He was, even during his time as commander-in-chief, really a very vocal supporter of religious toleration. There was a lot of anti-Catholicism in, even before, far more than anti-Semitism. There was a tremendous amount of anti-Catholicism, and there was a custom on Guy Fawkes Night, which had to do with the rebellion against Parliament back in the 17th century, but it was still being celebrated even in the colonies and even in America. You would burn the Pope in effigy. And Washington issued an edict ordering his troops not to do that, not to burn the Pope in effigy on Guy Fawkes Night. He was a Freemason, and at that time it required all of its members that they not be atheists, but by the same token that they be tolerant of differences in religion. We have a letter that he wrote to his estate director in Mount Vernon, his plantation, his farm, and he explicitly said, hire good workmen. They may be from Asia, Africa, or Europe. They may be Mohammedans, meaning Muslims, Jews or Christians of any sect, or they may be atheists. He just wanted good workmen. But the fact that he made very clear that their religious preferences should be irrelevant is a rather interesting detail. A historian, Ron Chernow, who has written, he was the guy who wrote the big book on Hamilton that became the musical. He's also written a biography of Washington. Chernow states, there has been a huge controversy, to put it mildly, about Washington's religious beliefs. Before the Revolutionary War, he was Anglican, Church of England, which meant after the war, he was Episcopalian. He was clearly Christian and was quite intensely religious, right? He uses the word providence, but not in a vague way. He constantly sees providence as an active force in life. So every single victory in the war, he credits to providence. The Constitutional Convention's success, providence, right? So all of those things are such that he did believe in a God that listened to prayer and could intervene and help people. the official term. So he wasn't a deist, the way that Thomas Jefferson was. We'll talk about that when we get to Jefferson. He was what is called a theistic rationalist. So he rejected core beliefs of Christianity. There's nothing that indicates that he thought much or embraced the divinity of Christ, the Trinity, the original sin, but he believed in the efficacy of prayer. On his deathbed, he didn't call for a priest or a minister, but he was buried, with the rites of the Episcopal Church from the local whatever the local Episcopal Church was. So that's Washington in a nutshell. He had personal relationships with a number of Jews, Chaim Solomon, but also various officers and those who served. Washington had, frankly, more contact with Jews than either of the next two presidents, Adams or Jefferson. Let me stop here if there are any questions, comments about our founding father, George Washington. Any thoughts? Just you can unmute. You can.
Want to say anything? Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, we'll continue with John Adams, who was as different from Washington as night and day. Washington was tall, big. He was 6'2" in a time when most men were short. Adams was maybe 5'6". He went to Harvard, and he was Washington was completely self-taught. He had military experience in the French and Indian War, whereas John Adams did not. Started out as Washington's vice president. It had little power, the vice presidency. He would hang out in the Senate. He obviously didn't vote unless there was a tie. Washington didn't really give him much to do. Vice presidents, as being, emissaries of the president, didn't really, the role of the vice president was to wait around in case the president died. Washington did not have him attend cabinet meetings with any regularity. In fact, John Adams called the 2 terms of his vice presidency a colossal waste of time and a great bore. When Washington steps down after 2 terms, he wins the presidency because he gets 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68, right? And that automatically, it was very close. The way things worked in the Constitution until the law was changed in 1804 is that whoever got the highest number of electoral votes was the president. Whoever got the second highest became the vice president. And it didn't matter, parties were very, very fledgling in those days, but it didn't matter if your vice president was diametrically opposed to your views. It was irrelevant. So Adams, unlike Washington, really didn't know much about Jews, didn't know any Jews. And having grown up in and around, Massachusetts was not a friendly place for Jews in the 17th and 18th centuries per se. All he knew really was what came from the Bible. And his correspondence with Jewish folks really was only after he left office in 1801. He's also the first president to live in Washington, which was nothing more than much of it was a glorified swamp. If you haven't had a chance, there is the series that was on HBO. I think it was a 4-part series about John Adams. is very well done, and is worth seeing. It's really pretty accurate and entertaining. So, couple of things that are important, though. First, in 1797, a crisis occurs pretty early on in Adams' administration. Things are going pretty badly, going south with France. Right, France was our great ally, but as the 1790s heated up, the revolution took place in France, and war broke out between France and England. Now, the United States was a neutral nation, and Washington did not want to get involved. The French tried to draw America in, saying, hey, we were there for you guys. But Washington realized that the United States was a fledgling country, weak, just starting out, and just could not afford to get sucked into a European war. Adams believed the same, and did not want to be involved either. The French were busy seizing American merchant vessels. There had been French pirates who were granted letters of marque, which meant that they could go raiding American vessels. And tensions were pretty high. So Adams sends sends a delegation of Americans to France to try and cool things off. But when they get there, they're met by 3 representatives from the French government, sent by the foreign minister, Talleyrand. And these 3 agents say, hey, you know, we could make all the problems go away, but before we negotiate anything, we need a $250,000 bribe. You know, Talleyrand wants some gelt, and you got to grease the ponds. And of course, this insulted and annoyed Adams no end. So what does he do? He publishes the correspondence. This becomes known as the XYZ affair. All of the details of the correspondence, the only thing that he withholds is the names of the 3 French agents in case they should have to deal with them again. So they become known as XYZ. But he publishes it, goes to Congress, and the proverbial you-know-what hits the fan. There's anti-French sentiment, and many of Adams' own party, he is a Federalist, they are clamoring for war with France. So he sets aside a day of national prayer and fasting. We have a record of a sermon that Gershom Satius, who was the reverend, who was the religious leader of Shereth Israel, the synagogue in New York, who actually takes a very conciliatory tone. Most Jews were very mindful that France was the first European country to grant Jews citizenship, long before any other country. So, as a result of within several years of the French Revolution, so many of the Jews actually had more sympathy toward France. And they weren't alone. Thomas Jefferson had a lot of sympathy toward the French as well. So this is a bad time for Jews in Europe. Jews living in Poland find themselves, Poland is ripped apart and partitioned by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. And the Jews that are under Russian control in particular suffer terribly. Now, some of them had expressed the hope of coming to the United States. This is really an echo of 100 years later, in a very small way. But during the Adams administration, some pretty noxious laws are passed. The Alien and Sedition Acts and the Naturalization Act there was a fear that there were lots of French supporters in the country who were willing to, if necessary, take over local governments and raise, despite the federal government's opposition, raise troops, arms, and money for the French in opposition to, the government's own policy. And that, of course, would have been seen as an act of war by the British. So these Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. You could be put in prison if you criticized the government. You could be deported if you were perceived to be an enemy of the state for having the wrong political opinions. And instead of a 5-year period to become a citizen, which had previously been the law, it was now 14 years. These laws, which were, actually Adams' own party kind of pushed on him, he did agree, but they certainly cost Adams the election in the year 1800. He did not win, but many of the members of the Jewish community were opposed. Right? So what we see is that Jews here, many of them who had been in the Federalist Party, as it was called, switched their allegiance to the Democrat Republicans. They like that, the Democratic Republicans. That was Jefferson. They're not Democrats or Republicans as we think of Democrats and Republicans. The difference was the Federalists were very big on central government, strong central government, and tended to be more sympathetic to England and siding with England against France, even just for purely practical purposes. The Republicans under Jefferson were much more sympathetic to France and also were very suspicious of centralized government. So Benjamin Nones, we heard before, right? He had been the major on Washington's staff. He participates in the Republican Convention of 1800, the presidential convention. He is criticized by the leading Federalist paper, the Gazette of the United States, which was actually founded by Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, of course, is dead by this point. And the Gazette of the United States calls him out as a Jew, a Republican, and poor. I'm not sure which is the worst insult, Jew, Republican, or poor. And Nunes replies very, very passionately. I'll just read an excerpt of his reply to the Gazette of the United States. But it's an echo here, really, of the first time we see party politics in an election, and also party politics rearing its head in the Jewish community. And this is what Nunes writes: "I am a Jew. I glory in belonging to that persuasion which has preserved its faith, secure and undefiled for near 3,000 years. I am a Republican. I have not been so proud or so prejudiced as to renounce the cause for which I have fought as an American throughout the whole of the Revolutionary War. I am a Jew, and if for no other reason, for that reason I am a Republican. In republics, we have rights. In monarchies we live, but to experience wrongs. How can then a Jew but be a Republican? I am poor. Yes, I am so. My family also is large, but soberly and decently brought up. They have not been taught to revile a Christian because his religion is not so old as theirs." So that's Nunes's very pungent reply. But But here we see, partisanship. It's the year 1800, and it's there in the Jewish community. So the Jews actually support Jefferson overwhelmingly, but don't think it was Jewish support that causes Jefferson to win. There are maybe 3,000 Jews. Right? The Jewish population has doubled, but you're talking about 3,000 Jews in the United States in its entirety. Adams, in his later correspondence, actually says some very interesting things. He makes a statement that is almost proto-Zionist in supporting Jews returning to their ancestral homeland. But he also has some somewhat negative things to say, that he wishes that Jews would become Unitarians. That they would, not all of this, all of the trapping, but, and that some of their habits are, he calls it some of the asperities and peculiarities of their character, that they should possibly in time become liberal Unitarian Christians. For your Jehovah is our Jehovah, and your God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is our God. But it would be wrong to think that Adams spent much time thinking about Jews. He certainly didn't. He dies. He lives a long life after the presidency, 25 years after he leaves Washington. He lives long enough to see his son become president in 1824. And in one of the ironies of history, he dies a couple of hours after Thomas Jefferson. They both die on July 4th, 1826. Jefferson dies earlier in the day, Adams at night, but it's one of those, freaky and interesting and moving things as well. In their last years, they reconciled and had a fruitful correspondence, but during the height of their political careers, sparks flew. Let me stop with Adams. Any questions about anything that I shared? Go ahead. Is that Roy, Georgia? Go ahead.
I got it. It's okay.
Well, the comment that was made calling, was it Jefferson who called him or Franklin, who you said who called him a Jew?
No. Franklin's dead. It was Franklin's newspaper, which
Franklin's newspaper, yeah.
That he established way back. No, Franklin's dead, and can't blame Ben Franklin for anything in 1800.
But the fact that they called him a Jew, I guess that was a slander of the day, or two.
Well, if you're a Federalist,
still is,
right? Calling somebody a Republican is not a compliment. And yes, I'm sure calling him a Jew is not meant to be a compliment either. But then again, notice that Nunez replies and, doesn't, he stands for flush, whatever, square. He dishes it out as much as, perhaps even more so. So he obviously felt comfortable. He didn't feel like he had to apologize to anybody. John?
I cannot remember the name of the book that I read about this, but it was by the former Israeli ambassador, Michael Oren, a few years ago, about American experience in the Middle East in general. And part of the interesting early number of diplomatic appointments to various parts of the Middle East, Levant, whatever the term you're using, were Jews. Oddly enough,
We'll see that one of later, a little bit later. I
can't remember particularly.
Madison in Madison's term.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mordecai Manuel Noah is sent as counsel to Tunis
Okay.
Yeah, and although he is later removed and alleges that there's religious prejudice, not that the United States was being prejudiced, but because in Tunis they were Mohammedans, and they didn't like the idea of a Jew,
Hmm.
being a council there. But on the other hand, I'm not sure why a Christian would have been any better.
Mhm.
But
The thrust of Oren's book, as I recall it, it's been a couple of years since I've read it, was that, quote, they seem to have a special knowledge of the area. That term came up a number of times in the text, that they were seen as having special insights.
right, well, or John Adams, who writes Mordecai Emmanuel Noah at one point, that's to whom he makes this kind of proto-Zionist response.
Mhm.
He had sent a book about some of his travels in Europe, and he thought Adams, people, send things.
Mhm.
And in those days of letters and correspondence, people would respond. So Adams read the book and he said, I'm sorry that you didn't go to write to ancient Palestine and lead 100,000 of your Jewish brethren, as if every Jew must intimately know,
Mhm.
the biblical. But then again, if your whole knowledge of Jews and Judaism is through the Bible, you have a kind of skewed view, and so Adams was not the only one who made assumptions that Jews would be intimately familiar with the Holy Land, even if they had never ever set foot there.
Thank you.
Is that yes, Alexandra?
Hello, I have
Hey.
a question. So
Yeah.
going back to when they called him like a Jew, a Republican, what time period was that again?
Okay, remember that Republican is not what we call Republican today.
Yeah.
But it was 1800, 1800.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about Jefferson. Okay, that'll be our last one for tonight. So Jefferson is, like Adams, educated, but in the South, right? He is from Virginia. He goes to the College of William and Mary. He is a successful lawyer. He is elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses, and is then appointed to the Continental Congress. He gets assigned with Adams and Franklin to write the Declaration of Independence, which is mostly his. Adams and Franklin make some suggestions, Franklin especially, but the language is almost all Jefferson's. The idea is not so much. They were typical ideas of the Enlightenment. Much of Jefferson was very influenced by John Locke, but the prose is his. And of course, that most famous and important line: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That line was to have, obviously a huge amount of resonance. Let's not forget that, Jefferson was also a slave owner. He fully appreciated the contradiction in what he espoused as opposed to what he practiced. But he also never sought to, in any way, eliminate that contradiction. Just lived with it. Washington, by the way, freed all of his slaves after his death. His will, but not Jefferson. Jefferson also died, with lots and lots and lots and lots of debts. So he also felt, I'm sure, whatever his noble impulses, if they were there, that he couldn't afford to do that. So he only freed a handful of slaves, and the rest were sold to help pay off his debts. Now, Jefferson was really a true deist. He believed in a supreme being, but not in the efficacy of prayer or God was a supreme being who made the world and then kind of gave it a kick out the door, and that was that. So both Washington and Adams had issued proclamations of that there should be a Thanksgiving Day of national prayer. Jefferson refused to do that. He said, I consider the government of the United States forbidden by the Constitution for meddling with, it's not the government's role to tell people that they should have a national day of prayer. It's hard to imagine, Jefferson, for all of the reverence we have. Can you imagine a president saying that today? No prayer. What is the government shouldn't be involved with actually any kind of prayer. So, no prayer. That being said, he did go to church services regularly, and there's a funny story that a fellow stopped him one Sunday on his way to church while he was president. Jefferson is the second president actually to live in Washington and be in the White House, and says, "Hey, where you Mr. President, you got a hymnal under your arm. I thought you don't believe in any of this stuff." And his response was, "Sir, no nation has yet existed or been governed without religion. I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example. Good morning, sir." So, in other words, no, you're right. I don't believe any of this, but it's good for you. So I go to church because I want to set a good example, not because I believe it. So, what you make of that, I don't know, but that was Jefferson. That being said, he was a passionate believer in religious tolerance. Our First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, assuring the freedom of religion, was actually an echo of a law that Jefferson wrote for Virginia's state constitution back in 1785. The Virginia Ordinance for Religious Freedom, which made it very clear that no person could in any way be taxed, molested, or penalized for the expression of religion, or equally important, the lack thereof, if he was not, possessed of religious opinion. And maybe even more famously is his letter to the Baptists of Danbury. We think of Baptists today as being very, very into religion and state, and the state professing religion. That was not always true, especially of American Baptists. Right before the Civil War, there was only one denomination. As a result of the Civil War, the church split in two, and that's how you have Southern Baptists. But they were big into, they were the dissenters. They were the odd man out, right? If you were living in New England, in Connecticut in particular, you had Congregationalists, right? You had Episcopalians, and Baptists were seen as, kind of a little risque. And so they write a series of letters to Jefferson. This is while he's president. And in January of 1802, this is what he writes to the Baptists. "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." He's referring to the First Amendment. And then he finishes, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. So that's where that phrase comes from Jefferson. So as I said, Jews living in the United States tended to be big Jeffersonians. He did appoint a fellow, Reuben Edding, as U.S. Marshal for Maryland in 1801. And here's the interesting thing. Things were kosher because it was a federal position, that Edding could be appointed as a federal marshal by Jefferson. But if it had been a state position, he couldn't have been. Why? Because Maryland state constitution at the time called for any state officer to declare his belief in Christianity. And this was true of many state constitutions. And federal courts in those days really did not meddle with state affairs. So the irony is that as a federal marshal, the Constitution protected him, not only because of the First Amendment, but because there is a clause in the Constitution that prohibits administering religious tests to serve in any office. But that didn't exist in Maryland state constitution. And in fact, if you're wondering when Maryland took all mention of religion out of its state constitution, the answer is 1961. I know that's kind of unbelievable. I mean, they took out Christianity a lot earlier, but until 1961, you had to at least swear an oath that you believed in God. And that went to the Supreme Court, and a fellow who was seeking state office, who was an atheist, won the case. Jefferson, two other little interesting things. When the Jews of Charleston, began to move toward reform, right, having a reform approach to Judaism, Isaac Harvey, who was one of the machers of the South Carolina Jewish community, sent to Jefferson an interesting speech about the reforms that they were making, which Jefferson said, I approve of. It seems reasonable. You want to be keeping up with the times. And the second is that Jefferson himself had a low opinion of Judaism, not because he was anti-Semitic, but because he didn't have a high opinion of organized religion in general. But he knew his Bible. He saw the Hebrew God as cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust. He saw all of the rules and laws of the quote unquote Old Testament as being more primitive, and that Christianity, though filled with superstition itself, to his mind had a greater sense of reason, and therefore, if it was more in conformity with the laws of reason, it was a higher form of religious practice. He obviously knew very little of the Talmud. What he heard of it did not impress him. He said there's only one treatise in the entire Talmud on moral subjects. Apparently he's referring to Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the sages. But he never read anything, including the ethics of the sages. So, that's just an interesting aside. Last thing is, what's interesting about Jefferson is not in his life, but really his death. As I mentioned, he died hugely in debt. In fact, his last years he was constantly struggling with debt. He had to sell his entire library of 6,500 books to the government, actually, in order to pay off some of his debts. That became the nucleus of the Library of Congress, its collection. The original Library of Congress was destroyed when the British came and burnt Washington during the War of 1812. So Jefferson struggled, and his heirs didn't have the money to maintain Monticello or its grounds. it became very dilapidated. It fell into disrepair. But he had a great admirer, a much younger man who had started his naval career right about the time Jefferson was leaving office, and that was Uriah Phillips Levy. Became a Commodore, Commodore Levy. And Levy was a great admirer of the president. He purchased Monticello to refurbish it and to restore it. So Monticello was restored thanks to a Jewish naval officer, Commodore Levy. Eventually, one of his nephews, Congressman Jefferson M. Levy, notice whom he is named after, lived and used Monticello as a summer house. And Levy's mother is buried at Monticello, so you can find her grave there if you look for it. So it's very interesting. So even though Levy didn't, he didn't have any relationship with Jefferson personally, he admired him greatly, and thanks to him, the house was preserved and repaired long before it became, this national trust. But we have a lot of what was saved thanks to Uriah Phillips Levy. So I'm going to stop here. Our time is pretty much up. Those were our founding fathers and some of their Jewish relationships. Let me stop for, questions, comments. Go ahead, John. I see. Okay, John, and then I think we have something from the Stearmans. Go ahead.
Well, two small things. One is a quote from Jefferson about religion in general. And I think it's from the Adams-Jefferson letters, but he said that, if I've got the quote right, it doesn't matter to me whether my neighbor believes in no gods or 20 gods. It neither hits my leg or picks my pocket.
That's yes.
The other one you related about the federal appointments, because I remember reading a famous letter by the Jewish community of Philadelphia. Pennsylvania's legislature was pretty radical in the aftermath of the revolution, and they had passed a similar law that you had to be a practicing or professing Christian to have office. And it was a circular letter, as I would call it, that is the entire community signed on to it, saying, wait a second, guys, sorry, this isn't, we participated too, and sorry, you really need to rethink this idea, because we're just as patriotic as everybody else is.
Right. And so there was disparity between state governments and the federal government for a long time. And I think the federal government very deliberately, because it was very careful about sensitivities at the state level, not to tread too much into state affairs. Manny, did you?
Just to expand upon Thomas Jefferson's love for religious freedom, on his epitaph, and I have pictures of it. I can't find it now, but he only mentioned 3 things on his epitaph. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and the father of the University of Virginia, and the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So he did not even consider to have put on his epitaph that he was president of the United States.
Yeah, no, and that's really about right. And those were the things that he was proudest of.
He wanted to be remembered as the president of the University of Virginia,
or the founder.
Or the founder.
Yes.
That was his crowning achievement to him. Interesting.
Absolutely. So, other questions, comments about our 3 founding fathers tonight? All of them, fascinating in their own right and so different in so many ways. Evelyn?
I say I typed mine.
I'm sorry?
I typed mine in chat.
Oh, okay. Then we gotta go to the chat. Thomas and Jefferson designed the basic beginning of the University of Virginia. Yeah. Living in the quad, right? Monticello is an amazing place to visit. His inventions. Yeah.
Do you know he had a
Um,
form of air conditioning in Monticello?
You mean other than the slaves that fanned him?
Yes. No,
Okay.
seriously. And then he had that clock calendar.
Yeah. Oh, and you're also right. Yes, Commodore Levy was the one that got rid of the Cat O' banished whipping
Yeah.
in the U.S. Navy.
And also, isn't Yulee named for him?
No. That's David.
David Yulee.
Yeah, David Levy, who interesting guy, lived a little bit later, and was not in the. He was a businessman and a Floridian, and a convert to Christianity, but he was born Jewish. But Uriah Levy stayed Jewish all his life.
Of course, Jefferson appointed his military aide, a young Army captain by the name of Lewis, to find another Army officer to go out and explore the new French territory.
Yes. Yes.
We went to Monticello. Oh, sorry.
Lewis and Clark. Yes.
Yeah, went to Monticello a few years ago with Helen, and of course, part of the tour, you get the garden tour. And Levy's mother is buried in the middle of what's called Mulberry Row, which is where the slave quarters were and where the kitchen gardens were at Monticello. So there is, and it's prominently marked. You can't miss it. Right in the middle of Mulberry Row.
That's the Jewish cemetery there.
Yeah.
This looks like an X-ray.
All right. Well, I really appreciate everybody joining us tonight. We'll move on next time and look briefly at the presidents after Jefferson and through John Quincy and Andrew Jackson, and we'll start to see some of the first things where the American government is asked to take issue or to take a stand on affairs affecting Jews internationally, and that will be next time around. So,
thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. And you haven't voted, you still have time, but not much. And, I wish you a good night, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.